Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you and Ranking Member McCaskill for holding this hearing. Thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today, and to the members of law enforcement represented here today. I want to thank you for your work. I had the opportunity to visit some of the ports of entry that CBP runs last spring to look at your efforts around drug interdiction, and we are very grateful for the hard work and risks that your officers take. I wanted to get down to what I think Senator Peters began to get to, which is what this hearing really is all about. What this hearing comes down to for me is whether the federal government should be keeping children in detention indefinitely while waiting for a judge to review their case. We are talking about the indefinite detention of children. That's frankly not who we are as a country, and it's not what the United States should become. Senator Peters referenced the American Academy of Pediatrics. It strongly opposes long-term detention of children. A March 2017 report from the Academy notes that such detention, and this is a quote, can cause psychological trauma and induce long-term mental health risks for children, close quote. The report goes on to say that detaining children can lead to physical and emotional symptoms such as post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation, behavioral problems, and difficulty functioning in school. I'm going to ask both Mr. Albence and Mr. Perez just to clarify your answer to Senator Peters. Are you aware of that report from the American Academy of Pediatrics? First, Mr. Albence.
If I could just clarify, we don't have indefinite detention.
My question is, are you aware of that report from the American Academy of Pediatrics?
I think I've seen media reports on that report.
Okay. And Mr. Perez?
I am not, Senator. If someone else in the agency may be, but I am not.
All right, thank you. We'll make sure that you get copies of it. In addition to the American Academy of Pediatrics, 2 physicians who work for the Department of Homeland Security came forward in July as whistleblowers. They had both visited detention centers housing children that provided an appalling lack of care, including finding, and this is a quote, an infant with bleed of the brain that went undiagnosed for 5 days. Those same physicians stated publicly that detaining children risks permanent psychological harm, placing children at risk of post-traumatic stress and depression later in life. So again, Mr. Albence, have you seen these statements from these DHS whistleblowers?
I don't believe I have, no.
And Mr. Perez?
I have not, Senator.
Beyond the pediatricians and the whistleblowers, Immigration and Customs Enforcement itself set up an advisory committee of subject matter experts to review family detention. And here's what the agency's own advisory committee found. It said that DHS should, quote, discontinue the general use of family detention, and that in cases where detention was absolutely necessary, families should be detained for, quote, the shortest amount of time possible. Now, given that it is DHS's own findings, I'm going to assume that you guys are familiar with that. Mr. Albence, given these findings from the American Academy of Pediatrics, DHS whistleblowers, and your agency's own advisory committee, why does Immigration and Customs Enforcement continue to support modifying the Florence Agreement to allow for the indefinite detention of children?
Okay, as I previously stated, we do not have indefinite detention. The Supreme Court has ruled on that.
But you are recommending the modification or overruling of the Flores decision, which would allow the indefinite detention of children.
Again, there is no indefinite detention of children. People are detained, and just
right now there isn't because the Flores
but again, our
agreement.
If you let me answer, please.
Excuse me, but I have limited amount of time here. And what I'm trying to get at is you are all here saying, or 3 of the 4 of you are here saying, that you want us to allow the federal government to do something that the Flores Agreement does not currently allow. So I understand your current position. But why are you here recommending a set of changes that would allow the indefinite detention of children?
Okay. What we are doing in this regulation is implementing the process as contemplated by the court in its ruling, which was requiring the licensing of that children could be held in licensed facilities. We have been unable to get state licensure in most places. What we have requested and are proposing underneath this regulation is to establish a federal licensing scheme, which will be similar and mirror to what we currently utilize in our standards, that would enable us to have the authority to hold these individuals. There's no one is arguing there's not a humanitarian crisis. I think the numbers show it.
Mr.
Humanitarian
Albence,
crisis also.
I have
people
limited
being
time,
smuggled
so
across
I'm
the
going to
border.
ask you to stop for a second, because what I'm concerned about is your own agency says that there shouldn't be indefinite or long-term detention of children, that it should be as short as possible. And instead of going towards the remedies that could help us, some that Senator McCaskill suggested, some that you've heard from other members of the panel suggested, instead of going towards those remedies to deal with the immigration surge, you are instead recommending something that experts in child development and welfare ask you not to do in your own people. Now, I want to go on to Mr. Perez. Why does CBP continue to support indefinite detention of children?
Thank you, Senator. I will respectfully just explain that from CBP's perspective, the modification of the Flores agreement is more so a deterrence and/or the ability to help deter a myriad of pull factors that exist throughout the entire immigration continuum, if you will, by creating a legal framework that does not create disparity in the treatment of single adults and/or family units.
Thank you. Because, again, I'm running out of time, I will follow up with you further. First, I'm going to suggest our office will get to you the various reports about the impact of on children of long-term, any kind of detention. Earlier this year, we were faced with a humanitarian crisis that President Trump created on our southern border. The administration decided that the best course of action was to forcibly separate thousands of children from their parents. That was an affront to American values, and Americans all across this country from all walks of life objected to it. And now the proposed solution that I'm hearing today is to keep children in detention indefinitely. We know that that is harmful to these children, just as forcibly separating children from their parents is. Pediatricians are telling us, DHS whistleblowers are telling us, that based on the conditions they're seeing on the ground, that this is wrong and bad for children, and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement's own advisory committee is telling us that. Not to mention that any parent can tell you how harmful detention and separation is to children. I won't support this committee moving forward with this legislation that allows the federal government to indefinitely detain children. I encourage my fellow members of this committee and fellow members of the Senate to do that. We have heard lots of suggestions of important and practical ways to deal with the backlog and to make sure people come forward not only for their first hearing, but also for all subsequent hearings in the immigration process. But it is absolutely unacceptable to detain children and to have the United States of America, the strongest, best country in the world, treat children this way because we don't want to do other things that are more difficult. That is not who we are. We are stronger than that, we are better than that, and we are far more capable than that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.